Now, this week has been a painful one for consumers, for renters and for savers. This was the week we learnt that the average house grew in cost by more than the average British salary this year. £27,000 increases, double-digit house price inflation. Similarly, the Consumer Price Index measure of inflation, which does not include housing costs, rose to 5.5%, the highest in a generation. Everything is becoming more expensive. People are really feeling the pinch. It's an unfamiliar crisis for this generation of political leaders. So who's to blame and what can be done? Well, joining me now is Mark Littlewood, the Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Welcome to the programme, Mark. First of all, let's get to the crux of this issue. We've printed a lot of money over the last 2 years. Is that to blame for these rising prices?
In part, Tom, I think it is. There's a whole range of different factors that go into prices going up. You can't necessarily hold somebody to blame for each and every one of them. I mean, if we were to look at energy prices, those are, if you like, naturally going up. It's a prevailing market rate. The government's probably making it worse in terms of household domestic energy bills. But there's a whole plethora of things. But if you were to look at all of the things that cause prices to go up, printing money, or spending a lot of government money without productivity rising. You've mentioned housing, Tom. That's been a perennial problem for 20 or 30 years now that no government's really grasped. So all of the different measurements, I would say, are going in the wrong direction. And I'm afraid I don't have much good cheer for you or your viewers and listeners, Tom. You mentioned that CPI is at over 5% now. Some of the more optimistic forecasters think inflation could top out at about 7%. But I wouldn't be wholly surprised. This isn't a prediction, but I think it's within the remit of possible outcomes if we actually see inflation get into double digits. And that means all of us feel poorer. All of us indeed are poorer, especially those who are counting the pennies at the end of the week and struggling to get by. That becomes a colossal challenge. And I think that when people ask themselves, are they feeling richer than they were 2, 3, 4 years ago, the answer is no. And that tends to be bad news for the incumbent government.
Now, economists at your organisation, the Institute of Economic Affairs, had been warning about inflation for quite some time. I had Christopher Snowdon on my show last week who was saying just that. Yet the Bank of England didn't really see this coming. And now there's an infamous clip of the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, that the Labour Party is sharing, of him being interviewed last year saying he didn't think inflation was coming down the track either. Why were they wrong and the economists at the IEA were right?
Well, Tom, it's the normal operating procedure, Tom, for politicians to be wrong and the economists at the IEA to be right, I would say. I think the problem was partly this. There's been vast amounts of effective money printing, quantitative easing, as we call it in the terminology these days. Quantitative easing sort of really means money printing. We're not literally printing money. It is data transactions on a computer screen. But we'd had that for a very long while without inflation hitting. Some people were saying 10 years ago we're going to get a bout of inflation at any time. And oddly, without all of the sort of money printing, with a lot of things, again, going in the wrong directions, inflation didn't bite. It's only kicking in now. And I think that Boris Johnson and others may have got complacent. Just because it hadn't kicked in yet doesn't mean it isn't sooner or later going to arrive. In fact, it nearly always does. And I would liken it a bit, Tom, to shaking a ketchup bottle. That's what you're doing if you're printing a ton of money. That's what quantitative easing does. It doesn't mean the ketchup suddenly hits the plate immediately, but it does mean that you get this sort of burst at some point. And unfortunately, we're going to be having that burst now. The truly worrying thing is it's quite difficult to control. The great economist Friedrich Hayek said that once inflation's out and in the system, trying to tame it is the equivalent of trying to catch a tiger by the tail. So there are no very easy remedies for Boris Johnson to apply. Most of the remedies will be difficult. But one thing he could certainly consider is whether it's wise to be putting ordinary households' taxes up whilst they're already facing a cost of living crunch, as he is doing with the national insurance contribution rises, or whether he could take some mercy and actually see taxes begin to fall in other areas. Most obviously, if you cut VAT, for example, not a cheap thing for the government to do, but a tool in their armoury, that would tend to have a downward pressure on prices and inflation, but no sign, unfortunately, that that's in their thinking at the moment.
It's interesting. Tax cuts on the one hand. Could the other hand of this be some pretty painful spending cuts, potentially. After all, we know that sort of money is pumping up the whole system now. I suppose there are no painless ways out of inflation. After all, we heard the Governor of the Bank of England plead with people to not ask for pay rises in recent weeks, because that sort of sets in the spiral, people being paid more, prices going up, people being paid more, and then prices going up further. You can't get out of that trap without a sort of jolt. What painful jolt should the government consider?
Well, I think you're right on public spending, Tom. Looking at it from an inflationary perspective, the public sector is not as productive as the private sector. It doesn't show the same levels of productivity growth over the long term, although it's worth pointing out private sector productivity has not been great either. So if you're spending a lot more in the public sector, by and large, to oversimplify, you've got more money chasing the same sort of numbers of goods and services. If you're spending more money and the quality and quantity of goods and services aren't going up, guess what goes up instead? Prices go up. So I think that we've got to have a long, hard look at public expenditure. All politicians will tell you that it's near impossible to find any cut in government expenditure that isn't going to be extraordinarily painful. But we have allowed public expenditure to rise to an absolutely eye-watering level. Some of that was to do with the pandemic, sure, but there doesn't seem to be any area of government expenditure that Boris Johnson or Rishi Sunak seem even interested in trimming. And I think we've got to work out whether, for example, our absolutely massive welfare bill is properly targeted. For the amount of money we're spending on welfare and transfer payments, it's amazing that we haven't completely eliminated poverty in the UK. That seems to be a rather directionless and huge sum of money at the moment. And if we are determined to keep spending more on the NHS, there are now going to have to be trade-offs, because we're going to have to spend less elsewhere. And of course, as interest rates rise, they're only ticking up narrowly at the moment, Tom, but I guess it wouldn't be an imprudent guess to suggest that they keep going up. Well, the government's servicing of debt rises. The amount they're having to pay back on all the money we've borrowed for the last 20 years and more, that becomes more expensive. So that's just straight off the top of government spending. If their debt repayments and deficit servicing, if that has to rise, then there is, by definition, just as a matter of maths, not as a matter of ideology, less money to spend on other things. So I think a comprehensive spending review brought in quite rapidly would be a useful way of dealing with it, not to reach for tax rises, but over the longer run, Tom, and this is where really what we should be looking at, because I think we're going to have a tough, good few months, possibly a tough year, whatever the government does. We've got to ask ourselves why productivity has been so poor in the UK for a good decade now. Really disappointing rates. And that requires a whole new economic policy, I think, of allowing the private sector to breathe, deregulating, and attempting to get taxes down inch by inch rather than up inch by inch, which is what successive governments have done.
It's a tricky situation for politicians to grapple with. I suppose in finishing this conversation, I should say that inflation is also a tricky problem in Europe and in America as well. Politicians around the world have taken these similar decisions and are reaping similar consequences. But for now, Mark Littlewood, thank you very much for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Really important to go over those issues there.